The brass nameplate still gleamed wet from tears when Thomas Whitmore stepped through the mahogany doors of First National Bank of Copper Ridge. 23 years had passed since he'd last crossed this threshold, then as a desperate rancher begging for more time, hat literally in hand. Now the same floorboards creaked beneath hand-stitched Italian leather, and every eye in the building tracked his measured stride toward the teller's cage where Margaret sat frozen. She hadn't aged gracefully. The woman who'd once laughed at his calloused hands and patched shirts now bore the weight of 2 decades spent counting other people's money, her face mapped with lines that spoke of small disappointments and smaller dreams. Her wedding ring, the one she'd chosen over his grandmother's simple band, caught the afternoon light filtering through windows he now owned. "Hello, Margaret." The words fell between them like stones in still water. She looked up from her ledger, and for one heartbeat, he saw the girl who used to wait for him after church, before she decided a bank clerk's steady wage trumped a cattleman's uncertain future. Before she chose Edmund Carruthers and his father's guaranteed inheritance over Thomas and his 100 head of stubborn longhorns. "Thomas." Her voice cracked on his name. I heard you'd done well for yourself." Done well? As if the railroad contracts and the silver mines and the empire he'd built from nothing were merely luck. As if the nights he'd spent studying contracts by lamplight, the risks that nearly broke him, the years of sleeping in lined shacks while she slept in silk, as if none of it had been carved from his bones. The other customers had grown silent, sensing something electric in the air. Even young Jimmy Patterson, Edmund's nephew who'd inherited his uncle's arrogance along with the family business, had stopped his usual bluster mid-sentence. Thomas reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a leather portfolio, setting it gently on the counter between them. Margaret's hands trembled as she recognized the bank's own seal on the documents within. "What is this?" she whispered. But she already knew. They all knew. The rumors had been spreading through Copper Ridge like wildfire for 3 days now, about the mysterious buyer, about the cash offer that couldn't be refused, about how the bank that had stood as the town's financial cornerstone for 40 years had been purchased outright by a single investor. Thomas opened the portfolio with deliberate slowness, revealing page after page of legal documents, each one bearing his signature. The deed to the bank building. The articles of ownership. The notice of management change, effective immediately. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as her eyes found his name at the bottom of each page. Not the broken rancher she dismissed, but Thomas J. Whitmore, sole proprietor of Whitmore Holdings, owner of half the silver claims in Nevada and a railroad that stretched from Denver to Sacramento. "I believe," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent bank, "we need to discuss your employment status, Mrs. Carruthers." The clock on the wall ticked through 30 seconds of absolute silence before Margaret found her voice. "Thomas, please." "You can't what?" He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. Power, real power, was always quiet. "Can't own a bank? Can't make business decisions? Funny how things change when a man's name is on the deed instead of his hat being in his hands." She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor like fingernails on a coffin lid. The other employees, Sarah Mills at the next window, old Pete Henderson counting coins in the corner, they all watched with the morbid fascination of witnesses to a hanging. Jimmy Patterson had gone pale as winter wheat, no doubt calculating how this would affect his own comfortable position. "I never meant..." Margaret started, then stopped. What could she say? That she'd been young? That she'd been afraid? That choosing security over love had seemed like wisdom rather than cowardice? Thomas studied her face, seeing past the years to the girl who'd danced with him at the harvest social, who'd promised to wait while he built something worthy of her, who'd broken that promise the moment Edmund Carruthers made his interest known. "You never meant what, Margaret? To laugh when I asked your father for your hand? To tell the whole town I'd never amount to anything more than a dirt farmer with dreams too big for my britches?" His words were measured, each one placed with surgical precision. "Or did you never mean to marry Edmund 3 weeks after I left town?" The color drained from her face. Behind him, Thomas could hear Mrs. Davidson gasp. The old woman had always loved her gossip, and this was better than Christmas morning. I was 19, Margaret whispered. I was scared. So was I. Thomas closed the portfolio with a soft snap. Difference is, I let my fear make me stronger. You let yours make you small. Jimmy Patterson finally found his courage, stepping forward with the bluster that came from 20 years of unearned privilege. Now see here, Whitmore. You can't just waltz in here and… Thomas turned, and something in his eyes made Jimmy's words die in his throat. This wasn't the desperate young rancher who'd begged for a loan extension. This was a man who'd stared down claim jumpers and railroad barons, who'd built an empire one calculated risk at a time. Can't what, boy? Thomas asked softly. Can't exercise my property rights? Can't make personnel decisions in my own establishment? He paused, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Your Uncle Edmund taught me a valuable lesson about business. Sometimes the smartest move is knowing when you've lost. Margaret sank back into her chair, understanding finally dawning in her eyes. This wasn't just about the bank. This wasn't even about revenge. This was about a reckoning 23 years in the making, about choices and consequences and the price of believing that love could be measured in dollars and social standing. What do you want? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas reached for the brass nameplate on her window, lifting it with reverent care. Margaret E. Carruthers, assistant manager. How proud she'd been of that title, how it had validated her decision to choose respectability over passion. I want, he said, setting the nameplate in his coat pocket, to offer you a choice. The same kind of choice you gave me all those years ago. The bank held its breath, waiting to learn what justice looked like when it finally came calling. The choice, when Thomas finally laid it bare, was elegant in its cruelty. You can stay, he said, his voice carrying the weight of mountain granite. Keep your position, your salary, your comfortable life. All you have to do is work for the man you said would never amount to anything. Margaret's hands gripped the edge of her desk until her knuckles went white. Around them, the bank had transformed into a theater, every customer and employee an unwilling audience to this drama decades in the making. Or, she managed, or you can walk away with your pride intact. But if you stay, Margaret, if you choose to remain in my employ, then every morning when you walk through that door, you'll remember what you threw away. Every transaction you process will be signed with my name. Every decision will require my approval. Jimmy Patterson sputtered indignantly. This is outrageous. Uncle Edmund would never. Uncle Edmund is dead. Thomas cut him off with surgical precision. Has been for 5 years now. And his debts, your debts, are what put this bank on the market in the first place. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Jimmy's face cycled through confusion, denial, and finally, dawning horror as he realized what Thomas was implying. The gambling debts Edmund had hidden, the loans made to friends who never repaid them, the slow bleeding of capital disguised as shrewd investments, all of it had been carefully documented by Thomas's investigators over the past 6 months. Margaret closed her eyes, understanding flooding through her like winter water. You've been planning this. 23 years, Thomas confirmed. Every contract I signed, every mine I purchased, every mile of track I laid, all of it leading back to this moment, this choice. The same choice you gave me when you decided I wasn't worth the risk. Sarah Mills had begun crying quietly at her station. Pete Henderson stared at his coin counter as if it held the secrets of the universe. The customers shifted uncomfortably, caught between the desire to flee and the morbid fascination of watching a man's life's work reduced to ash. The loan, Margaret whispered suddenly, her eyes snapping open. The loan you asked for, the extension we denied, would have saved my ranch, yes. Would have let me hold on to the grazing rights that became the foundation of my fortune. Ironic, isn't it? Your husband's refusal to risk the bank's money on a broke rancher ultimately cost him everything. Thomas pulled out his pocket watch, a gift from the Southern Pacific Railroad after his crew had completed the most dangerous stretch of mountain track ahead of schedule. The inscription read, "To Thomas Whitmore, who makes the impossible inevitable. You have until this watch reaches 4 o'clock to decide." he said, snapping it closed. Stay and work for the man you deemed unworthy, or leave and maintain whatever dignity remains to you. Margaret looked around the bank that had been her world for 23 years, at the faces of people who'd become her substitute for the family she'd never been able to give Edmund, at the comfortable cage she'd chosen over an uncertain flight. And if I stay? She asked, her voice steady for the first time since he'd walked in. Thomas's smile was winter cold. Then you'll learn what I learned, Margaret. That some choices echo for decades. That some debts can only be paid in full. That sometimes the price of security is watching everything you thought you wanted crumble in the hands of someone who understood its true value. The clock on the wall ticked toward 4 o'clock, each second a heartbeat in the silence that had fallen over the First National Bank of Copper Ridge, now and forever the property of a man who'd never forgotten the sound of a door closing on his dreams. But outside, storm clouds were gathering over the mountain peaks, and Thomas Whitmore was about to discover that some reckonings cut both ways. At 3 minutes to 4, Margaret did something that surprised them both. She laughed. Not the bitter sound of defeat, but something raw and honest that cut through the tension like morning light through fog. She looked up at Thomas, really looked at him, and for the first time in 23 years, she saw past the empire he'd built to the man who'd built it. You know what the terrible thing is? She said, her voice carrying a weight of regret that seemed to age her before their eyes. I loved you. God help me, Thomas, I loved you more than I'd ever loved anything in my life. The admission fell between them like a bridge either had expected. Jimmy Patterson's bluster died in his throat. The watching crowd seemed to lean forward, sensing something shifting in the carefully orchestrated drama. But I was 19 and terrified, Margaret continued, tears beginning to track down her cheeks. My father was dying. The drought had taken half the crops. Edmund offered security, certainty, a future that didn't depend on weather or luck or whether the cattle made it through winter. Thomas felt something crack inside his chest, a sound like ice breaking on a spring river. This wasn't the script he'd written during all those nights planning his return, his reckoning, his perfectly calibrated revenge. I know what you're thinking, she said, standing slowly. That fear makes cowards of us all. And you're right. I chose the safe path, the comfortable cage, and I've regretted it every single day since. She moved around the desk, each step deliberate, until she stood directly before him. Close enough that he could see the flecks of green in her brown eyes, the same eyes that had haunted his dreams across 2 decades and a dozen different states. Edmund was a good man, she whispered. Kind, stable, everything I thought I wanted. But he wasn't you. And I spent 23 years trying to convince myself that was enough. Thomas's watch ticked toward 4 o'clock, but he no longer heard it. The bank, the customers, the carefully planned humiliation, all of it seemed to fade as Margaret reached into her desk drawer and withdrew something wrapped in faded blue cloth. She unfolded the fabric carefully, revealing a small daguerreotype in a tarnished silver frame. Thomas recognized it immediately, a picture taken at the harvest dance, the two of them young and laughing, his arm around her waist, her head against his shoulder. He'd given her the only copy, thinking they'd have a lifetime to make more memories. I kept it, she said simply. Through the wedding, through the years, through everything. Edmund never knew. It was the one thing I couldn't bring myself to throw away. Thomas stared at the photograph, seeing not the successful businessman he'd become but the hopeful young man he'd been, believing that love could conquer anything, that dreams were worth more than guarantees. Margaret, I'll stay, she said quietly, pressing the photograph into his hands. Not because I have to, but because maybe some debts can't be paid with money or humiliation. Maybe some of them can only be paid with truth. The clock struck 4, its chimes echoing through the suddenly quiet bank. But Thomas no longer cared about schedules or revenge or the careful choreography of retribution. He was holding a piece of his past, looking into the eyes of the woman who'd shaped his future, and discovering that victory could taste remarkably like loss. Outside, the first drops of rain began to spatter against the windows, and Thomas Whitmore realized that some storms, once started, changed everything in their path, including the man who'd summoned them. 6 months later, Thomas stood at the window of what had once been Edmund Carruthers' office, watching Margaret lock the front door of the bank as evening settled over Copper Ridge. She'd kept her word, staying on as his employee, processing transactions with quiet dignity, never once asking for special treatment or acknowledgement of their shared past. But something had changed between them in those months, something neither had expected when he'd first walked through those doors with revenge in his heart and her nameplate in his pocket. It started small, a good morning that lasted a heartbeat longer than necessary, a shared smile over a customer's confused attempt to deposit a chicken instead of cash, moments of recognition that bypassed 23 years of separation and found the young people they'd once been. "Mr. Whitmore?" Margaret's voice came from the doorway, formal as always during business hours, though now he heard the careful distance she maintained, the professional armor that protected them both from the dangerous territory of what might still be possible. "The deposits are balanced," she continued, setting the day's receipts on his desk. "And the Patterson account. Jimmy wanted me to tell you he'll have the payment by Friday." Thomas nodded, though they both knew Jimmy Patterson would likely never recover from his uncle's debts. The boy had learned humility the hard way, working odd jobs around town to keep his family's account from closing entirely. Perhaps that was punishment enough. "Margaret," Thomas said as she turned to leave. She paused, her hand on the doorframe, and for a moment she looked exactly as she had at 19, uncertain, hopeful, afraid to believe in possibilities. "The photograph," he said, reaching into his desk drawer where he'd kept it all these months. "You should have it back." She shook her head slowly. "It belongs to the past." "Does it?" The question hung between them like a challenge, like a prayer, like the first tentative note of a song they'd both forgotten how to sing. Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded Thomas of other evenings, other possibilities, other versions of themselves that might have been. Margaret stepped back into the office, closing the door behind her with a soft click that seemed to seal them away from the world, from the weight of years and choices and the careful distance they'd maintained. "I destroyed us both," she said simply. "My fear, my choice, it broke us both in different ways." "Maybe," Thomas replied, setting the photograph on the desk between them. "Or maybe it taught us what we were really worth. Maybe we needed to lose each other to understand what we'd found." She moved closer, drawn by something neither could name, until she stood close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she'd always favored, could see the silver threads in her hair that somehow made her more beautiful, not less. "I can't undo 23 years," she whispered. "Neither can I," he said, reaching up to touch her cheek, feeling her lean into his palm like a flower turning toward sunlight. "But maybe we don't need to. Maybe we just need to decide what comes next." The bank was silent around them, full of the weight of decisions and consequences and the strange mercy of second chances. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed the hour, marking not an ending but a beginning, not a reckoning but a recognition that some stories are too large for a single lifetime, too important for a single chance. Thomas Whitmore had come home to claim his revenge and found something infinitely more valuable: forgiveness, understanding, and the radical possibility that love, real love, was patient enough to wait for hearts to find their way back to each other, no matter how far they'd wandered or how long the journey home. The photograph lay between them on the desk, two young people frozen in a moment of pure joy, while their older, wiser selves reached across the years to discover what had always been true: that some connections transcend time, choice, and the simple human fear of taking the greatest risk of all. The camera pulls back slowly through the window as two silhouettes merge in the golden light of evening, and the screen fades to black.